In the autumn of 1874, inside the gas-lit parlors of Boston's intellectual elite, a 9-year-old girl named Mary Whitmore became the subject of the most baffling and terrifying medical file in the city's history. Dr. Alastair Finch, a man of science and a protege of the renowned Oliver Wendell Holmes, Seer, filled 4 volumes of private case notes about a child whose quiet presence seemed to tear at the very fabric of the human mind. To the society that had embraced her, Mary appeared as a portrait of orphaned innocence, a cherubic face with eyes the color of a stormy sea. Yet beneath that calm surface, Dr. Finch recorded a phenomenon that defied the era's growing understanding of medicine and psychology. Over the course of 1 year, 5 individuals in her immediate circle descended into madness, despair, or complete catatonia. A shadow fell over a prominent Beacon Hill family, a series of tragedies never connected by law, yet all linked by a little girl whose gentle smile never quite erased the unsettling stillness in her gaze. The official hospital records were later classified and archived, buried under medical jargon and professional discretion. But the unvarnished truth found in Dr. Finch's private journals reveals a form of darkness that challenges everything we believe about the power of a child's influence and the fragility of the human psyche. Before we delve into the haunting account of Mary Whitmore and the silent terror that gripped one of Boston's most respected families, if you find yourself drawn to the mysteries hidden in history's forgotten corners, please consider subscribing to our channel and activating the notification bell. You won't want to miss our explorations into these dark and compelling narratives. And we're always curious to know where our community of history lovers is watching from, so please drop your city or state in the comments below. We truly appreciate hearing from each and every one of you. The chain of events that would cement Mary Whitmore's name in Dr. Finch's secret annals began not with a scream, but with an act of charity. Boston in 1874 was a city of stark contrasts, a hub of scientific progress and literary genius, yet also a place where the Civil War's wounds still festered, leaving a generation of orphans behind. The Cartwrights of Beacon Hill were the very picture of Boston's enlightened aristocracy. Henry Cartwright had amassed a fortune in shipping, and his wife Eleanor was a celebrated patron of the arts and a devoted philanthropist. They had built a life of calculated grace and intellectual rigor, their home a bastion of order and reason. But their lives were marked by a quiet sorrow. They had been unable to conceive a child of their own. When word reached Eleanor of a particularly bright and well-mannered orphan at the St. Jude's foundling home, a girl left parentless by a cholera outbreak, she saw it as a sign. Mary Whitmore was everything they could have hoped for. She was small for her 9 years, with cascades of dark hair and a pale, delicate complexion. She arrived at their townhouse carrying only a small, worn book of poetry. Her demeanor was one of profound gratitude and quiet obedience. She learned her lessons with astonishing speed, spoke only when spoken to, and never once complained. To the Cartwrights and their social circle, she was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a flower blooming from the ashes of tragedy. Henry Cartwright, a man who trusted numbers and ledgers above all else, was particularly taken with her. His wife Eleanor, whose passions ran more toward art and emotion, saw in Mary a vessel for all the maternal love she had longed to give. Neither was equipped to see what lay behind the child's perfectly composed mask, nor to understand that the newest addition to their home was not a child seeking love, but a researcher seeking subjects. Mary was a creature of observation, her stillness often mistaken for shyness. She spoke little about her life before the orphanage, offering only vague, rehearsed sentiments about her departed parents. What most impressed the adults in her life was her remarkable composure. In a child who had endured such loss, they expected tears, nightmares, or fits of temper. Mary displayed none of these. She moved through the grand house with a silent, graceful purpose, her stormy eyes taking in every detail, every conversation, every subtle shift in mood. She seemed to possess an unnatural empathy, always appearing with a glass of water before a headache was announced, or a comforting hand just as a moment of sadness began to take hold. Dr. Alastair Finch made his first acquaintance with Mary Whitmore in November of 1874. He had been the Cartwright family physician for over a decade, a man who prided himself on his diagnostic acumen and his belief that every ailment of the body or mind had a rational physical cause. He was visiting to treat Henry for a bout of recurring gout when Mary was introduced. Dr. Finch, who had treated countless children in his practice, felt an immediate and inexplicable sense of unease. The girl was impeccably polite, curtsying as she had been taught, but her gaze was not that of a child. It was a look of intense, dispassionate evaluation. He would later write in his journal, "She assessed me not as a person, but as a mechanism." Her eyes scanned my face, my posture, my hands, as if she were cataloging my functions and identifying my potential points of failure. I felt like a watch being inspected by a master craftsman, and for a moment I was certain she could see the inner workings of my own mind. The Cartwright household was run with the precision of a fine clock, a small army of servants ensuring its seamless operation. It was among the staff that the first signs of discord began to appear. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper for 20 years, a woman known for her unshakable composure, became uncharacteristically irritable and forgetful. She complained of being watched, of hearing whispers in empty hallways. She attributed it to the fatigue of old age, but her decline was rapid and alarming. She would often see Mary in the periphery, standing silently at the end of a corridor or in the shadow of a doorway, simply observing her work. Whenever their eyes met, Mary would offer a sweet, placid smile before gliding away, leaving Mrs. Gable with a profound and lingering sense of dread. The family's 2 Irish setters, once boisterous and friendly, grew hostile in Mary's presence. They would whine and retreat to the far corners of a room when she entered, refusing her gentle offerings of treats. On several occasions, they were heard growling low in their throats, the hair on their backs raised as she passed by. Henry Cartwright dismissed it as the dogs being unused to a child in the house. But Dr. Finch, a keen observer of animal behavior, found their specific, targeted aversion highly unusual. It was as if they sensed a predator that the humans could not. The first true casualty was Mary's governess, Miss Agatha Croft, a Cambridge, educated woman in her late 30s. She was the picture of intellectual and physical vitality. She was hired to oversee Mary's education and was initially delighted by the girl's quick mind and obedient nature. But within 6 weeks of her arrival, Miss Croft began to change. She suffered from crippling insomnia, often pacing her room all night. She wrote to her sister of vivid, terrifying nightmares and a growing sense of paranoia. Convinced that other members of the staff were plotting against her, she became certain that her books were being moved and that pages were missing from her private diary. She confided in Dr. Finch during one of his visits, her voice a strained whisper, that she felt her own thoughts were no longer her own. She described Mary's unnerving habit of staring at her for long periods during their lessons without blinking, as if waiting for something. "It's as though she is listening for a crack in a porcelain vase," Miss Croft had told him, her hands trembling. "She is not learning from me. She is studying me. And I fear she is finding what she is looking for." Dr. Finch prescribed a tonic for her nerves, but he was deeply troubled. He could find no physiological reason for her sudden and dramatic decline. 2 weeks later, Miss Croft was found weeping uncontrollably in her room, claiming she could no longer remember her own name. She was quietly dismissed and sent to a private sanatorium in the countryside, her career in ruins. Mary was the one who alerted the Cartwrights to the governess's breakdown. She approached Eleanor with wide, concerned eyes, her voice filled with a perfect imitation of childish worry. "I think something is wrong with Miss Croft," she had said. "She is crying and saying things that don't make sense." The Cartwrights praised Mary for her sensitivity and quick thinking, seeing her as a witness to a tragic but unrelated mental collapse. They failed to notice the glint of dispassionate curiosity in Mary's eyes as the former governess was escorted from the house. Eleanor Cartwright held Mary close, assuring her that everything would be all right, never suspecting that the child in her arms was not a bystander to the tragedy, but its architect. Dr. Finch, however, was unable to shake the governess's words from his mind. He began to keep a separate private file, hidden from his official records. It was labeled simply, "The Cartwright Case." He started it with a single troubling question. Was it possible for one human being to act as a poison upon another? Not to the body, but directly to the mind. The second incident occurred a month later, involving the family's butler, Mr. Alastair Jennings. Jennings had served the Cartwright family for over 30 years. A man of steadfast routine and robust health, he was the anchor of the household, his presence a symbol of its stability. In early January 1875, Jennings began to suffer from debilitating migraines, so severe they would leave him disoriented for hours. He, a man who could recall every detail of the household's inventory, began to have startling memory lapses. He would forget which wine to serve at dinner, misplace important correspondence, and once addressed Henry Cartwright by his late father's name. These were not the gentle failings of age, but abrupt, jarring disconnects from reality. Jennings confided in Dr. Finch that the episodes were always worse after he had been in Mary's company. The child had taken a liking to him, often following him as he went about his duties, asking endless, detailed questions about his life, his memories of the family, and his work. He described it as a gentle but relentless interrogation. "She asks about my wife, who passed 10 years ago," Jennings told Finch, his voice heavy with confusion. "She wants to know the color of her eyes, the sound of her voice, the exact words I said to her on our last day. She forces me to relive it all over and over. It feels invasive." Once again, Mary was central to the discovery of the final breakdown. She found Jennings collapsed in the pantry, clutching his head and unable to speak coherently. She calmly alerted Mrs. Cartwright, providing a description of his symptoms that was so precise, so clinical in its detail, that Dr. Finch was astonished. She noted his pupil dilation, the pallor of his skin, the specific cadence of his confused mumbling. It was the detached observation of a fellow physician, not the panicked report of a frightened child. Dr. Finch's examination of Jennings revealed nothing. There was no sign of a tumor, no indication of stroke. The man's mind was simply fraying, heartbroken. The Cartwrights were forced to grant their most loyal servant an early retirement, sending him to live with his sister in the country. At his farewell, Mary presented him with a small hand-drawn picture of a ship on the ocean. "So you won't forget Mr. Cartwright's business," she said sweetly. The gesture was seen as incredibly thoughtful, but Dr. Finch, watching from the doorway, saw the cold, analytical look in her eyes as she watched the once proud butler shuffle away, a broken man. He noted in his file that the drawing was not just of any ship, but a perfect replica of the Oz Eleanor, the vessel that had sunk years earlier, taking Henry's younger brother down with it. A memory Jennings had once shared with the girl in confidence. The household was now shrouded in a subtle but pervasive unease. 2 pillars of the staff had crumbled in a matter of months. The Cartwrights, however, remained blind, attributing the events to unfortunate coincidence. Their affection for Mary only deepened, seeing her as a source of light in a darkening time. But the shadow was now turning toward the family itself. The Cartwrights' nephew, Edward, the 12-year-old son of Henry's sister, was a frequent visitor to the home. He was a boisterous, happy boy, full of life and mischief. He initially treated Mary as a curiosity, a quiet little doll to be teased. But Mary did not react to his pranks with anger or tears. Instead, she began to spend more time with him, engaging him in quiet conversation, her head tilted with an expression of intense interest. Soon, Edward's personality began to shift. He grew sullen and withdrawn, abandoning his usual games for hours of silent brooding in his room. He was plagued by terrible nightmares, waking the house with his screams. He spoke of a shadow man who watched him from the corner of his room, a figure only he could see. He lost weight, and dark circles appeared beneath his eyes. His mother grew frantic, but no doctor could find a cause. Dr. Finch, however, suspected the source immediately. He began making more frequent visits to the Cartwright house specifically to observe Mary's interactions with the boy. He discovered that Mary had become Edward's sole confidant. She would spend hours with him in his room, ostensibly reading to him or playing quiet games. But one afternoon, standing outside the boy's closed door, Dr. Finch heard Mary's soft, melodic voice. She wasn't reading. She was speaking in a low, even tone, describing in graphic, horrifying detail the process of being buried alive. She spoke of the darkness, the weight of the earth, the feeling of suffocation, the sound of one's own heart pounding in the suffocating silence. She was not telling a ghost story. She was delivering a lecture. Finch burst into the room to find Edward pale and trembling, his eyes wide with terror, while Mary simply looked up from her chair, a placid, innocent expression on her face. "I was just trying to make him feel better about his fear of the dark," she explained calmly. The explanation was so absurd, so brazen in its inversion of the truth, that Dr. Finch was left speechless. Dr. Finch now knew he was no longer observing a series of strange coincidences. He was witnessing a campaign. Mary was not a passive vector of some unknown malady. She was an active, intelligent agent of psychological destruction. He dedicated himself to uncovering her past, believing that some profound trauma must be the root of her behavior. He spent weeks visiting the Satine, Jude's foundling home, interviewing the staff, and poring over the scant records kept on the orphans. What he found was not a history of abuse, but a chilling pattern of quiet influence. The matrons described Mary as a model child, but noted that she had an almost hypnotic effect on the other children. Fights would break out between her bunkmates over trivial matters she had quietly instigated. One particularly cruel older boy, a bully who had tormented the younger children, suddenly developed a paralyzing fear of birds after Mary told him a series of stories. Another child, Mary's only friend, had simply stopped speaking one day and never uttered a word again. In every case, Mary was at the center, an island of calm in a storm of her own making. There was no single event, no great tragedy to explain her. It was as if she had been born with a fundamental piece of her humanity missing. Dr. Finch began to subtly probe Mary's own psychological state during his visits, engaging her in conversations designed to gauge her emotional responses. He spoke of sad stories of loss and grief, carefully watching her reactions. She displayed a perfect pantomime of sadness, her brow furrowing, her lip trembling on cue. But her eyes remained cold, clear, and analytical. She understood the mechanics of emotion but felt none of it. Her curiosity, however, was boundless, particularly regarding the mind's breaking points. "Doctor," she asked him one day, her tone one of pure academic interest, "at what point does a memory become more real than the present moment? Can a person be made to live inside a nightmare, even when they are awake?" The question, coming from a 9-year-old, was so advanced, so specific in its terrifying implication, that Dr. Finch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. He was conversing not with a child, but with a born experimental psychologist whose field of study was human suffering. He knew then that the danger was far greater than he had imagined, and that the final act of Mary's experiment in the Cartwright house was yet to come. The turning point, the moment that transformed Dr. Finch's terrifying suspicions into absolute certainty, came not from an observation, but from a discovery. Believing that Mary must be keeping some record of her thoughts, some key to her inner world, he began to search for a diary or a journal. On a day when the family was out, he used his privileged access to the house to search her room. It was impeccably neat, a picture of childhood innocence, with dolls arranged on the bed and storybooks stacked neatly on a shelf. There was no diary, but as he ran his hand along the back of her wardrobe, he felt a loose panel. Inside, he found a small wooden box. What it contained was far more disturbing than any written confession. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were small personal tokens. A silver hairpin belonging to Miss Croft, the governess, a brass cufflink from Mr. Jennings's uniform, a small tin soldier that belonged to young Edward, and next to them, a new addition, a delicate lace handkerchief belonging to Eleanor Cartwright. Alongside these trophies were sheets of paper covered in a precise, elegant script that was far too mature for a 9-year-old. They were not diary entries. They were clinical notes. Beside each object, Mary had documented her methods and observations. For Miss Croft, subject exhibits high intelligence but is prone to anxiety. Primary vulnerability, professional pride. Method, subtle gaslighting. Repositioning of personal items, auditory suggestion, whispers. Result, rapid onset of paranoia, cognitive breakdown within 43 days. For Mr. Jennings, subject is anchored by memory and routine. Primary vulnerability, grief over deceased spouse. Method, repeated evocation of traumatic memory, disruption of daily patterns. Result, induced migraines, temporal lobe confusion, memory fragmentation. For Edward, subject is emotionally immature, susceptible to fear-based suggestion. Primary vulnerability, nectophobia, fear of the dark. Method, direct implantation of phobic imagery through narrative. Result, severe night terrors, withdrawal, arrested development. Dr. Finch felt the blood drain from his face. This was not the work of a troubled child. This was the methodical research of a monster. And the handkerchief, lying next to a fresh sheet of paper, told him who the next subject was. The notes for Eleanor Cartwright had only a single sentences: subject appears emotionally resilient. Primary vulnerability, fear of loss of control. A new approach is required. Dr. Finch was now faced with an impossible situation. He held in his hands evidence of a systematic psychological assault. Yet the evidence was meaningless to the outside world. How could he go to the police and accuse a 9-year-old girl of driving people mad with whispers and misplaced objects? They would think he was the one who had lost his mind. The science of 1874 had no name for this. There was no concept of psychopathy. No framework for a child born without a conscience who viewed other human beings as mere specimens for study. He knew that any attempt to expose Mary would be dismissed. The Cartwrights would defend their darling angel. The world would see him as a hysterical doctor, and Mary's experiments would continue unimpeded, with a new, more dangerous subject in her sights: Eleanor Cartwright herself. He had to act, but he was utterly alone, armed only with a truth so monstrous it was unbelievable. That evening, he decided on the only course of action left to him. He would not go to the authorities. He would confront the monster directly, in her own lair. During his next visit, under the guise of checking on Eleanor's recurring headaches, he asked to speak with Mary alone in the library. He closed the heavy oak doors, the silence of the room amplifying the pounding of his own heart. He placed the wooden box on the table between them. Mary looked at the box, then at his face. She showed no fear, no surprise, no shame. Her expression was one of mild disappointment, like a researcher whose experiment had been interrupted by a clumsy lab assistant. She simply folded her small hands in her lap and waited. "I know what you are doing," Dr. Finch said, his voice low and steady. He described her notes, her methods, her victims. He laid out the entire horrific pattern. Mary listened with polite attention, occasionally giving a small, thoughtful nod, as if confirming the accuracy of his assessment. When he had finished, a long silence filled the room. Then Mary spoke, her voice as soft and clear as a silver bell. "You are not going to tell them," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the serene confidence of a chess master who sees the entire board. "And why would you think that?" Dr. Finch asked, his professional curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. A small, genuine smile touched Mary's lips for the first time since he had met her. It was a smile of pure, chilling intelligence. "Because no one would believe you," she said simply. "They see a child, you see the truth, but your truth is too ugly for their world. And besides," she added, her stormy eyes locking onto his, "you are too fascinated to stop it. You are a man of science, Dr. Finch. You want to see how it ends. You want to understand me, and I am the most interesting subject you will ever have." She was right. He was horrified, but he was also captivated by this complete anomaly of human nature. He had to understand the source of this darkness. "What do you want with Eleanor?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mary's smile faded, replaced by an expression of serious, scholarly contemplation. "The others were simple," she explained, her tone conversational. "Their minds were like locks that were easy to pick. But Mrs. Cartwright is different. Her will is strong. She has built walls of piety and social grace around her mind. I want to see what it takes to bring the whole fortress down. I want to see what is left of a person when you take away everything they believe themselves to be." The implication was clear. Her experiment with Eleanor was just beginning, and it would be her masterpiece. Dr. Finch knew he was running out of time. Mary's calm confession, her total lack of remorse, and her stated intention to destroy Eleanor Cartwright meant the threat was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. The girl had laid her plans bare, with the chilling self-assurance of someone who believed she was untouchable. And her past successes proved she had every reason to be confident. That very night, Dr. Finch went not to the police, but to the only man in Boston he thought might listen: Dr. Silas Ware, the superintendent of the McLean Asylum. A man known for his unconventional and forward-thinking approaches to mental illness. Ware was a pragmatist who had seen the darkest corners of the human mind and had little patience for societal niceties. Dr. Finch presented his case methodically, laying out the timeline of events, the decline of the victims, and finally the contents of the wooden box and Mary's own disturbing confession. He presented it not as a tale of supernatural evil, but as a case study of a previously undocumented mental condition, a congenital moral insanity. Ware listened intently, his gaze fixed on the meticulous, childlike script detailing the methodical destruction of human minds. "If even a fraction of this is true, Doctor, we are in uncharted territory," he said, his voice grave. "We cannot have her arrested for suspicions and theories, but we can observe, and we can be ready to intervene." Weir, a man who understood the intricacies of the law, knew that they needed more than Finch's notes. They needed to catch her in the act, or at least to document the effects of her influence, in a way that could not be dismissed. The two doctors devised a plan. Dr. Finch would insist on becoming Eleanor Cartwright's primary caregiver for her nervous condition, allowing him daily access to the house and to Mary. He would document every interaction, every subtle shift in Eleanor's behavior. Dr. Weir, using his authority, would arrange for two of his most trusted and discreet nurses to be hired as household staff, replacing others who had conveniently decided to leave. They would be his eyes and ears, providing round-the-clock observation. Their goal was to build a case so detailed, so irrefutable, that it would force the world to see the monster hiding behind the innocent face. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for the predator to make her move. The plan went into effect the following week. Dr. Finch began his daily visits, finding an increasingly anxious and fragile Eleanor Cartwright. She complained of sleepless nights, of a constant feeling of being watched, and of a strange sense of confusion. She would misplace objects only to have Mary find them in obvious places, making her feel foolish and forgetful. Mary was her constant shadow, a picture of loving concern. She would read to Eleanor from the Bible, her soft voice emphasizing passages on guilt, paranoia, and madness. She would brew her special herbal teas, which Dr. Finch quickly analyzed and found to contain trace amounts of belladonna. Not enough to kill, but enough to cause mild hallucinations and disorientation. Mary was orchestrating Eleanor's descent with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. The nurses, disguised as a new maid and a footman, provided Dr. Finch with daily reports that confirmed his fears. They observed Mary whispering to Eleanor as she dozed, rearranging furniture in her room at night to cause confusion, and subtly contradicting things Eleanor said, making her doubt her own memory. It was a masterful campaign of psychological warfare, so subtle that each individual act seemed trivial, but the cumulative effect was devastating. The climax arrived on a storm-lashed night in late February. Dr. Finch was summoned to the Cartwright house by an urgent message. He arrived to find the home in chaos. Henry Cartwright was in London on business. The staff were huddled in the kitchen, terrified. One of the disguised nurses met him at the door. "It's Mrs. Cartwright," she whispered, her professional composure broken. "The girl has had her alone for hours." Dr. Finch raced up the grand staircase to Eleanor's bedroom. The door was locked. From inside, he could hear nothing but the sound of the wind and rain. With the help of the nurse, he forced the door open. The room was cold, the fire in the hearth long dead. Eleanor Cartwright was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the storm. She was awake, but her eyes were vacant, unseeing. She did not respond to her name. She was a beautiful, empty vessel. Mary was sitting on a stool at her feet, calmly brushing Eleanor's long hair. She looked up as Dr. Finch entered, her expression one of serene accomplishment. "Good evening, Doctor," she said, her voice betraying a hint of excitement. "I believe the experiment is complete. The fortress has fallen." To Duckett, Finch rushed to Eleanor's side. Her pulse was steady, her breathing even, but her mind was gone. She was in a state of profound catatonia, locked away in some inner world where no one could reach her. "What did you do?" he demanded, turning on the small girl. Mary set the hairbrush down carefully. I simply helped her find her greatest fear, she explained, her tone that of a teacher explaining a complex theorem. She wasn't afraid of death or illness. She was afraid of being nothing, of being an empty room. So I opened the door for her and let her walk inside. I found the one memory she had buried deepest, a childhood terror of being abandoned in a silent house. And I made it real for her. For the last 3 hours, I have been her only companion, describing in detail how everyone she loves has left her, how the house is empty, how she is utterly and completely alone in the world. Eventually, she simply agreed. As Mary spoke, she moved toward the fireplace, picking up a heavy iron poker. It was a gesture of casual, calculated menace. And now, she continued, her voice hardening for the first time, I have a new question. What happens to a man of science when he is confronted with something he cannot cure, cannot explain, and cannot defeat? She was no longer a child. She was a predator, confident in her victory. But she had made one miscalculation. She had not accounted for the 2 nurses who now entered the room. Their professional demeanor was replaced by grim resolve. They were not ordinary servants. They were trained attendants from Weir's asylum, accustomed to dealing with violent and unpredictable patients. Before Mary could react, they had her, their movements swift and efficient. The struggle was brief but shocking. The small girl fought with a silent, vicious fury, biting and scratching, her placid mask completely gone, replaced by a face of pure, cold rage. But she was no match for the 2 trained professionals. They subdued her and held her fast. Dr. Finch, his heart pounding, could only stare at the scene, the broken woman in the chair, the furious, captured child, and the storm raging outside. A perfect reflection of the chaos that had been unleashed within that house. When the authorities finally arrived, summoned by Dr. Finch, they were met with a scene that defied easy explanation. There was no crime scene, no weapon, no physical evidence of an assault. There was only a catatonic woman and a silent 9-year-old girl. Mary Whitmore was, as she had predicted, never charged with a crime. Without a confession, and with the victim unable to testify, there was nothing the law could do. Henry Cartwright returned from London to a ruined life. His wife was committed to the McLean Asylum, where she would live out the rest of her days in a silent, unbreakable trance. Under the powerful medical authority of Dr. Finch and Dr. Weir, and with Henry Cartwright's desperate consent, Mary was remanded to a special isolated wing of the asylum. She would not be a patient in the traditional sense, but a subject of intense study. A living embodiment of a darkness that medical science was only just beginning to name. The decision was a compromise that satisfied no one. The law had been thwarted. Justice had been circumvented. But a danger had, for the moment, been contained. Dr. Finch dedicated the next 2 years of his life to studying Mary. He spent hundreds of hours with her, documenting her every word, her every action, trying to map the contours of a mind that operated on a completely different plane of existence. His journals from this period became a foundational text in the nascent field of criminal psychopathy, though they would not be published in his lifetime. Mary, for her part, adapted to her new environment with chilling ease. She treated her confinement not as a punishment, but as a new laboratory. She learned to perfectly mimic the emotional responses the doctors wanted to see. She could produce tears on command, perform contrition with heartbreaking sincerity, and speak of her illness with a vocabulary she gleaned from the medical texts the doctors foolishly left within her reach. She charmed many of the junior staff, convincing them she was a traumatized but brilliant child who was making a miraculous recovery. But Dr. Finch was not fooled. He saw that she was merely refining her techniques, learning to manipulate more sophisticated subjects. He observed her as she subtly turned patients against one another, creating chaos and paranoia on the ward for her own detached amusement. She was cataloging human weakness on an industrial scale, her understanding of psychology growing more advanced with each passing day. The subject has learned to use our own diagnostic language against us, he wrote in his final report. She is building a better mask, and I fear what will happen when she has perfected it. She does not feel remorse. She performs it. She does not feel empathy. She simulates it. We are not curing her. We are educating her. The most disturbing discovery came from Dr. Martha Lancaster, a pioneering female psychiatrist from Philadelphia, who was brought in to offer a new perspective. She noticed that Mary had convinced a sympathetic orderly to provide her with extra paper and pencils for art therapy. The drawings she produced were childlike and innocent, pictures of flowers, houses, and animals, which the staff saw as a sign of her healing. But Dr. Lancaster, who had studied cryptography, recognized patterns in the seemingly random details. The number of petals on a flower, the number of windows on a house, the direction a bird was flying. It was all part of a complex cipher. When decoded, the messages revealed Mary's true thoughts. They were not drawings. They were escape plans. They were psychological profiles of every doctor and nurse on the staff, detailing their weaknesses, their fears, their vanities, and they contained plans for a future far beyond the asylum walls. One decoded message read: Dr. L is susceptible to intellectual flattery. Superintendent W prides himself on control. Chaos is his greatest weakness. The new couple from Austria are looking for a prodigy, not a patient. They are the key. In the summer of 1877, just after her 12th birthday, Mary Whitmore vanished from the McLean Asylum. The official story was that she was transferred to a private facility in Europe at the request of a wealthy benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. Dr. Finch knew this was a lie. A wealthy, eccentric Austrian couple, fascinated by fringe psychology, had indeed visited the asylum. They had been utterly captivated by the brilliant, remorseful, and beautiful young girl who spoke 4 languages and quoted Plato. Despite the strenuous objections of Dr. Finch and Dr. Ware, the Cartwright fortune and a team of clever lawyers were used to secure her release into the couple's custody. Mary had not escaped. She had been liberated. She had studied the system, identified its weakest point, and manipulated it to perfection. Dr. Finch noted in his journal that on the day of her departure, several long-term patients on her ward erupted into violent, inexplicable hysterics, as if the puppeteer had finally cut their strings. Her exit was as quiet and devastating as her arrival. The experiment was over, and the subject was now free. In the years that followed, Dr. Alistair Finch abandoned his promising career in mainstream medicine. He became an obsessive, solitary researcher, a man haunted by the ghost of the girl he had failed to contain. He began to collect news clippings and correspondence from across Europe, tracing a phantom's path. He found stories of a brilliant young woman who would appear in high society, leaving a trail of ruined families, financial scandals, and inexplicable suicides in her wake. There was the German industrialist who inexplicably signed his fortune over to a mysterious young ward before taking his own life. There was the Viennese diplomat whose wife descended into a violent paranoia that shattered his career. There was the Italian artist who created a series of terrifying, beautiful portraits of a dark, haired girl with stormy eyes before being committed to an asylum. The methods were always different, but the pattern was the same: a mind, a family, a life methodically and completely dismantled from the inside out. Finch realized that Mary's time in the asylum had been her university. She had emerged not as a child, but as a master of psychological manipulation, her skills honed and perfected. The Cartwright townhouse on Beacon Hill was sold after Henry's death in 1885. He died a broken man, having spent his entire fortune on his wife's futile care. The house was said to be haunted, not by spirits, but by a palpable sense of sorrow and confusion that clung to the walls. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, a monument to a family that had simply come apart. Dr. Finch's private journals, all 4 volumes, were discovered in his study after his death in 1902. His family, ashamed of what they saw as his late life obsession, kept them hidden. It was only in the 1950s that his great-nephew donated them to the Boston Medical Library, where they remain a chilling and largely unknown account of a predator who defied every category of her time. In his final entry, written the night before he died, Dr. Finch reflected not on Mary, but on her implications. "I have spent a quarter-century in the shadow of one child," he wrote, "and I have come to a terrifying conclusion. We have spent our lives learning to mend the body and chart the diseases of the mind. But we never considered that a mind could itself become the disease." Mary was not broken. She was a different kind of human entirely, one that sees the rest of us not as peers, but as puzzles to be solved and then broken apart for sport. She was the first of her kind that I encountered. I pray she was the last. This story reminds us that the most profound horrors are not always accompanied by violence and bloodshed. Sometimes evil is quiet, intelligent, and wears the face of an angel. The case of Mary Whitmore forces us to question the very nature of human connection and the terrifying possibility that for some, empathy is not a feeling but a language to be learned and used as a weapon. What do you believe happened to Mary Whitmore? Did she continue her dark experiments, or did she eventually find some semblance of humanity? Leave your theories in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts on this unsettling chapter of medical history. If this story captivated you and you're eager for more dives into the dark and the unknown, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with a fellow mystery enthusiast. The truth is often hidden in the stories we are afraid to tell, and history is filled with shadows that are still waiting to be explored. We'll see you in the next video.